Well, hello. I'm making a little video here to discuss the issue of intergenerational, how shall I say it, the intergenerational angst that seems to exist these days. There seems to be, in the online world especially, there seems to be a, um, a sort of generational uh, animosity, sort of a tribal warfare amongst generations. And I'm not sure how much of it is legitimate, and I'm not sure how much of it is fabricated by, unseen forces who stand to benefit from the whole, age-old theory of divide and conquer sort of a thing. So I was just thinking about this recently, and particularly, this is Christmas Day in the evening. It's Christmas Day, 2025, and it's a time when families tend to get together. All generations gather around the table and in the home and celebrate. And I got thinking that it's really kind of unfortunate that there is this intergenerational um, animosity, not universally, obviously. It's just if you look at trends, there seems to be a bit of a trend, particularly amongst younger people, younger than me. Um, I'm what they call Generation X. I was born, you could call me a mid Xer. It's a 15-year span between 1965 and 1980, and I was born in the middle part. I was born in 74, so I was born in the middle of the X grouping. And they say, well, we're the first generation that our mothers took pills to not have. So, take from that what you may. Um, we, growing up, like, we didn't know any different. As we were born, where we were born. I didn't have a say in any of it. But I was fortunate. I had good folks, good family, and no big complaints there. But it was definitely a different time, and I think when you grow up with a cohort of your peers, same time you experience the same cultural milieu, you're all boiled in the same pot together, so you all kind of share the same flavor a little bit. All the spices and seasonings that were there at the time, you sort of absorb them in, and and they influence your life, and so they're shared common cultural markers that, you know um, whether it be popular culture, the consumer society, you know the mass media, television, world events. So each generation has had their, landmarks that have impressed upon their minds some, you know, pivotal moment. Every generation has their turning point, so to speak. And it's been going on since forever. So we could say there was, for Generation X, we sort of came into this life at a time of uh, uncertainty in the world. There was, a fuel crisis. There was, you know, all sorts of little things that seemed big at the time. I'm guessing, I wasn't an adult, to fully grasp all the impacts of these things. But when you're a child, you don't realize any of this is going on. Well, I didn't know about the fuel crisis until I was, much older. And so each generation has their shared experiences growing up within that generation, and that's normal, and it's the way it's always been, and there's nothing really wrong with it. You go to school, the fashions, the clothes, the same things, and you can see it change over time. I look back now at school pictures, from public school, class pictures, from the very early 1980s, and it's like a different world I hardly recognize, but when you look at long, you realize, you remember, and and that all the girls look so lovely. They had all their dresses on for picture day, and it was just a different time, same world but different time. It was a different world. Well, it wasn't. It was the same world. It was just a different time, a different era, different generation, and different societal uh, markers that that we use to identify ourselves with, at any given time, whether it be clothing or automobiles or art or architecture. So there's there's these things that every generation shares, and we're only most familiar with the markers of the generation that formed us when we were, you know, young and impressionable and formative. And so we grew up with these influences on our lives, and so I kind of see there's a little bit of a bit of an artificial, people try to segment one generation from another, and statisticians uh, and sociologists, and which I'm neither one. I'm not anybody who should be speaking on this matter. I'm just a Gen X guy who's falling through the cracks. So we all have these unique individualities, and I think it's wrong to put too fine of a point on them, because if if you look at things and you try to separate and segment generations into very neat, clear cut, there's always overlaps. Culture is not a stair step. Culture is like waves on the ocean, and the wave goes up, and then you're into a trough, and then you're up, and then you're into a trough, and time flows like a river downstream. There's no, stair. It's not like one generation's here, and the next generation's here, and the next generation's here, and the next. It doesn't work that way. Time is constant, and the changes in society, the evolving nature of any civilization, there's very, very seldom in all of recorded history has there ever been stair steps where things go boom or boom up or down. It doesn't happen. It's always gradual, always gradual. And, very, the deluge, okay, there have been stair step instances where things have gone crazy. Tower of Babel, the deluge. But for in general terms, for all of history, one generation succeeds another and succeeds another. And so this modern idea of intergenerational division and drawing hard lines, well, if you're born in 1980, you're Gen X. If you're born in 81, or you're some, it's, I don't know, or boomers. If you were born in 64, you're a boomer. If you're 65, you're Gen X. Well, it doesn't work that way. You can you can try to draw hard lines for the sake of research, but in the real world, when you're talking to people, the lines are very blurry. You can talk to people of all ages who have reacted to things in the same way you have. We're all people, and so we react to things similarly. Just because you didn't watch the same television shows or the same commercials that were on TV or play with the same toys or read the same, magazines and witness the same world changing events, it's really, um, I wouldn't say it's irrelevant, but it's not the main thing that should occupy our time in terms of trying to live at peace with the world and with each other. And I think this is my own thinking on the matter. There are there are legitimate there are legitimate complaints that one generation may have against another. There, I'm not saying that every generation is uh, faultless. There's no perfect people in the world. Every generation is conditioned by everything that I've just said. And we imbibe the same sort of worldview, and it's passed down, and so we're always struggling to break free from this, um, this matrix in which we find ourselves, and and I think it behooves all generations to cut all the other generations sufficient slack, particularly the younger generations with regards to the older generations. There's a lot of angst and a lot of anger and resentment on the parts of younger people, particularly, I don't know, Gen Z. They seem to be the latest and greatest generation in the world, at least online. Seems to be where they spend most of their time complaining, complaining about you know older generations, whether it's boomers or Gen X. But I will say, as a Generation X, um, I don't think we had it particularly easy. I don't, at least me in my life, I was kind of born to lower income circumstances. I wasn't born with a silver spoon in my mouth. I was born to good parents, morally and otherwise. I have no complaints about my upbringing or anything. But there are things about my childhood and my upbringing that I shared with all of my peers at the time. Like we didn't. It was it was a different uh, experience growing up. I was born in '74, so when I was a little kid, it was like the late '70s. So when I was 4 years old, it was '78, '79, starting school, and so basically my schooling years started the last years of the 70s, and then all through the 80s, and ended in the first year of the 90s. So basically, I was uh, my most formative years at school were the 80s, I guess, for me. Um, and we shared all of the 1980s cultural vibes that were going around in the part of the world where I lived. And it was the way it was. I didn't. There was no, self-direction on our part. We were just kids. You do what you're told. You go to school. You go, do whatever extracurricular activities your family, offers, and your community offers. And so you're trying to figure out who you are and trying to learn about the world, and all of this. And there are big events going on in the world. When I was old enough to remember, the um, Chernobyl was kind of a big thing at the time. It seemed a big thing, Chernobyl, and then the fall of the Berlin Wall, the fall of communism. That all kind of happened in the 80s. There was financial uh, stuff going on that affected everybody. Like, I don't think anybody was really immune. Of the middle, you know, lower and middle class people were all affected by high interest rates, and things of that nature. So I was aware of that and all of those events going on in the larger world. And but where there was no um, instant communication, like there was none of this networking that went on. If you wanted the news, you watched the television or listened to the radio, or you bought a newspaper or magazine. So there was no cell phones. I never heard of a cell phone. I got my first cell phone in 2004 because I had to get one for work. That was the first cell phone I ever had. It was 2004, and I was 30 years old. So I lived the first, you know, I got a computer a couple of years before that. Um, but for prior to that, really, I didn't have anything to do with computers. Um, I didn't need them. I didn't need computers in my life, and I didn't need a cell phone in my life. We had a landline, phone on the wall. It's good enough. We got our news off from, every town had a newspaper, and if you had the money, you'd go and buy the Toronto Star, or the Globe and Mail, or the National Post, or something. If you wanted to read the foreign news. And there's television if you had a television. And of course, but this generation today now, it seems to be, harping the loudest at the thing. They have some legitimate points, I think they make. Particularly, I can relate to it, with being born at a time of, longer people are living longer, healthier, working longer. So when I was younger, it's kind of hard to get a job. Um, when I finished high school, there wasn't really the money there to send me off to secondary education, and I really didn't like the idea of going into debt for an education. So, um, and I had a job offer right out of high school so I went working in agriculture, and because I enjoyed it. It wasn't like a step down or anything. I really like doing it. So so I worked at that for for after high school, and but uh, I think every generation thinks that they have it harder than the previous generation, and I think that's a mistake because while there are certain elements of society that were easier for previous generations, whether it's the silent generation, my grandparents, or the boomer generation, or Gen X, or, every generation thinks that their parents had it easier or whatnot. But I'm not so sure because my grandparents were grew up in the Depression, and there was the Second World War, and then they had their kids, after the war, and raised them in the 50s. And then in the 60s, our parents were there was quite excuse me, but quite a bit of social unrest, political unrest, declared in the United States. Not so much here in Canada, but we could say that they had a little bit of an easier time financially when it came to employment. At that time, the economy in this country was doing quite well overall. It was doing quite well. We had a very good economy overall, best of I've been able to research, and based on what I've been told by people who were alive then. And so I think they had a little bit, interest rates were reasonably were reasonable, and real estate was reasonable, and there were jobs, and so I do think they had an easier time of it logistically speaking, and in terms is not to say there weren't problems in society. There's always problems in society, but uh, and so every generation has its challenges, and I think the key thing here is, assuming you're a normal functioning uh, person who's willing to work and who has a reasonable grasp of, the fundamental, educational requirements of life, and is open-minded enough to consider, different points of view, kind of hold them in tension while you work at which one is, right and wrong, and good or bad, beautiful or ugly. You have to sort of hold them, take that, take this, hold them in your hands, look at them, sort of hold them in tension, and then choose one or the other, and throw the other one out. It's the way you can't just a priority just throw one out because of an idealistic or whatever. You have to assess things and discern and choose your way, through life. You can't just um, say, well, I think all boomers are bad because they were born between, whatever, 45 and 65. It doesn't work that way. Or I think all Gen Xers are a bunch of, you know, losers, and or older people. So they might say, well, these millennials or these Gen Z or whatever, they don't want to work. I don't think that's helpful at all. And I think a breakdown in family life and a breakdown in the communal structures that once kind of fenced everybody in together, where it was sort of like a societal corral that sort of forced everybody, everybody was involved in the community. It was, especially in, more rural areas, there was the churches and community events and farming stuff, and it was all sort of uh, mingled up together. You had all generations, grandma and grandpa and the grandkids and everybody, and it was all sort of, and uh, it was much more homogenous, I guess you could say, society. We weren't all divided up into these little tribes off here, in our little palisades and shooting darts at each other. So I think it's important to try and look at things more broadly and see one generation just sort of flows into the next generation, and they flow into the next generation, and they flow into the next generation. And you have to look at it as a whole. You can't isolate one piece from another and be healthy. I don't think. You have to sort of take things, as enjoyable as it is sometimes, to form little uh, clubs. Well, I'm in the Gen X club, so that means that I'm this way or that way, and oh, it's enjoyable to do that sometimes and reminisce about the good old days, whatever those are. But every generation has their good old days, and it keeps moving up as time goes on. There's no, you know, who wants to go back to the good old days of 4500 BC? It's not going to happen. So that's all I really wanted to say was that I think the intergenerational angst of right now, and there seems to be a lot of it, is is it's unfortunate, it's unnecessary, and I think that there should be a greater effort made on the part of both boomers and Gen Z and everybody in the middle to look at one another with a little more respect and a little more deference. In particular, it's incumbent, I think, upon the junior to defer to the senior in virtue of uh, the hierarchical order of seniority in life. We are to respect our elders, and I think that's an injunction that's been given for a reason, because people who have lived uh, a good life for a long time have learned a lot of things about how to live a good life. And I think the younger generations really do need to sort of defer to that more than they do. And I know I'm not very old compared to, to some people. But I'm halfway there. I'm born in '74, and I've seen a lot of things, and I've done a lot of things, and I've done a lot of things wrong and made a lot of mistakes. And so I think it would be beneficial for younger people to try to tap into some of that experience and wisdom of the previous generations, and try to absorb some of the wisdom. To take the good. You don't want the bad. Just forget the bad, but the good. What good is there? And the only way you can do that is with a relationship. You're not going to absorb good things from your elders if you don't form some sort of an attachment, some sort of a relationship, and communication. It's all about, just making that connection. So it's a tricky business. There are other aspects to the societal dynamic which also play into this, but they're, you know, I, I'm looking at the clock here. I'm getting tired. It's the end of the day, and uh, I need to put my thoughts in order more. But there are other aspects to it. I mentioned the pill. I was the first generation that women took pills to not have, So there, that's the sort of attitude. Well, okay, I don't know. We might want to have kids. I don't know. Do we want kids? It's like, well, if we're gonna have kids, we'll just sort of have maybe one or two, and then and like sort of with the very minimum, And that's it's legitimate. It's a legitimate uh, thing that us Gen X kids, grew up with. Very few came from large families. It was one or two kids. It was, if there was three or four, that was a big family. When I was in school, if someone had like more than one brother or one sister, it was a very rare thing. It was just the way it was. It was one and two kids. And so there's a reason why there was only one and two kids when the previous generation had eight or nine or 10 or 12. So it's there. It's there. We were a little bit like, you know, but I think a far more significant effect on this, getting back to the pill, was um, the social uh, trends around feminism and the culture pushing this idea of um, egalitarianism and rather than complementarianism. So I think there's a lot that could be unpacked from that whole side. I don't want to get into that right now. It's the wrong end of the day. So that's it for now. I'm going to leave this subject for the moment, and just want to say that I think generations need to work together. People who are genuine and sincere about getting connected up uh, with other people. Don't let age be a factor to building a friendship or a relationship with someone. If you're in your 20s and you meet somebody who's in their 50s or their 60s or their 70s or their 80s, just treat them like a person. Treat them like a person. You might be surprised. You might be surprised. When I was 13, 14, 15 years old, I was thrust into a world of old men, men who were in their 60s and 70s and even 80s. And I am forever grateful for that because I learned so much. Their life experience, their little nuggets of wisdom that they shared with me, not even on purpose, it just came out, in talking but the things they would say and the little bits of knowledge that they would impart just off the cuff, off the hand, things that I'd never heard before. All of a sudden they're explaining to me something that has been obsolete for 50 years and yet was commonplace, and the knowledge that you can pick up and the life experience that they have that they're willing to share with you is worth the effort. So don't let age, whether you're a man or whether you're a woman, just don't let age stop you from being friendly to someone or treating them with respect if they're older than you or if they're younger than you or if they're the same age. Just, you know, you may disagree with their religion, you may disagree with their politics, you may disagree with any number of things that but don't let their age in and of itself define your relationship to them. Be open to making friends with people of all ages, whether it be family members or strangers. This age is just a number, and so I'm gonna leave it there for now. Take care, everybody, and I wish everybody a Merry Christmas season. Bye.